Mia Rivera had never thought of herself as someone who inherited legacies. She had always been the kind of person who built her own quiet corners of peace through effort and small, deliberate choices. When her Aunt Isabella passed away, leaving her a secluded piece of land on the edge of Maple Creek, Mia assumed it would be a modest retreat, an old cottage and a few acres of overgrown field where she could write, read, and breathe without the noise of city life pressing on her. But when she arrived for the first time, the air didn't smell of abandonment. It smelled of perfume, champagne, and freshly cut roses. The gravel path was swept clean, tire tracks crisscrossed the driveway, and a row of wooden benches stood under the oak trees, as if waiting for an audience. She stopped the car, the engine humming softly, her hand frozen on the steering wheel. The cottage was there, just as she had seen in childhood photographs. White paint weathered to gray, windows clouded with dust. But around it, something was undeniably wrong. White tents gleamed in the sunlight, strung with fairy lights, and an arch of pink flowers framed what looked like a ceremonial altar. For a long moment she thought she had taken a wrong turn, that maybe this was someone else's property, until she saw the mailbox at the entrance. Her aunt's name, faded but still legible. I. Rivera. When she stepped out of the car, a voice called to her from the distance, a man in a black vest carrying a clipboard. "Excuse me, miss. Guests aren't supposed to be here yet." She blinked, the words barely making sense. "I'm not a guest," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my property." The man frowned, glanced at his paper, and then at her. "Ma'am, this is the Montgomery estate. The ceremony starts at 4. You'll need to use the other road." His tone was final, polite, the kind of tone used with intruders who didn't know their place. Mia stood there, confusion twisting into disbelief. The Montgomerys lived next door. She remembered them vaguely, a family of polished smiles and money that gleamed like polished brass. They owned the sprawling mansion behind the hill, not this land, her aunt's land, her land. Later that day, when she spoke with the real estate clerk in town, the woman smiled sympathetically, but with a hint of unease. "Oh, the Rivera's property," she said, lowering her voice. "Well, you'll need to check with the county records office. There were some changes, I believe. The Montgomerys maintain the grounds now." The words felt like ice water. "Maintain?" Mia repeated. "You mean they use it?" The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They've been hosting events there for years. Weddings, mostly. I think they charge quite a bit. It's a beautiful location." That night Mia stayed at a motel, too unsettled to sleep. She found the property deed in her folder, signed and notarized, her aunt's name clearly listed as the sole owner, the parcel number matching the land she had just seen. There was no mention of any transfer, no note about shared ownership. The next morning, she returned at dawn, hoping the tents would be gone, the music silenced. Instead, she found white chairs lined up in perfect rows, and a group of workers polishing crystal glasses under the fading stars. A generator hummed softly, and beyond it, a woman stood on the porch with a phone pressed to her ear. Mia recognized her immediately. Lauren Montgomery, her late aunt's neighbor, impeccably dressed in cream linen even at sunrise. She turned when Mia approached, her expression cool, almost amused. "Oh," she said lightly, "you must be Isabella's niece. I've heard you inherited this lot. Congratulations. You must be proud." Mia's throat tightened. "What's happening here?" she demanded. "You're using my land." Lauren's smile didn't falter. "Your land? My dear, this entire stretch has been part of the Montgomery grounds for decades. Your aunt stopped maintaining it long ago, and frankly, no one's lived here for years. We simply made use of what was abandoned. You should thank us. It looks better than ever." Mia could barely breathe. "You built a wedding venue here," she whispered. Lauren shrugged elegantly. "We built an experience. People pay for beauty, and your aunt's little field had potential. You're welcome to attend an event sometime. Tickets are $15,000 a night if you're curious." Then she turned away, her laughter dissolving into the sound of clinking glasses and the murmur of workers setting tables. Mia stood alone, the weight of disbelief turning into something sharper, heavier. The air smelled of flowers and ownership, of something stolen yet carefully perfumed to disguise the theft. She thought of her aunt's last Christmas letter, written in shaky handwriting. "Keep the land safe, Carita. It carries our family's roots." Now that promise hung in the air like a challenge. The Montgomerys had not just taken the field, they had rewritten its story. And Mia, clutching the deed in her trembling hands, realized that the peace she had hoped to find here was already gone, replaced by the beginning of a war she never asked for, but could no longer avoid. 2 days later, Mia returned to the property determined to speak to someone from the Montgomery family in an official capacity. She had spent hours on the phone with the county clerk's office, confirming that her deed was valid, that no transfer or lien had been filed against the land, and that her name was recorded as the rightful owner. The clerk's tone was almost apologetic when she added, "Legally, the land is yours, Miss Rivera. But, well, local disputes like this can get complicated. I'd advise hiring an attorney." The warning echoed in Mia's mind as she drove down the long, winding road toward her aunt's cottage, the car bumping over gravel until she reached the familiar clearing. Except now, the air was different. It buzzed with laughter and the low hum of music. Cars filled the edge of the property, black sedans and luxury convertibles gleaming under ribbons of white fabric. A banner stretched across the oak trees. "Welcome to the Montgomery Gardens." She parked off the road, her pulse hammering. Strangers in tuxedos and pastel gowns were streaming in, holding champagne glasses, posing for photographs against a backdrop of her aunt's wildflowers, now trimmed into obedient symmetry. Before she could take a step forward, a security guard approached her, tall and expressionless behind sunglasses. "Ma'am, guests should enter through the main drive," he said, already moving to block her. "I'm not a guest," Mia said, forcing the words out. "I own this property." The guard frowned, his hand shifting to his radio. "This is private event property managed by the Montgomery family," he replied flatly. "If you don't have an invitation, I'll have to ask you to leave." The injustice struck her like a slap. "This isn't their land," she said, raising her voice above the soft thrum of music. "This is my aunt's property. My property." Heads turned. A few guests glanced her way, amused, assuming she was part of some spectacle. A photographer even took a picture before realizing she wasn't one of the event staff. The guard spoke into his radio, murmured something, and moments later, Lauren Montgomery appeared in a flowing champagne-colored dress, every hair in place, her smile glacial. "Miss Rivera," she said sweetly, as though greeting an old friend. "You really shouldn't make a scene. It's unbecoming." Mia could barely contain her anger. "You have no right to be here, to host anything here," she said. "I have the deed. This land isn't yours." Lauren tilted her head slightly, as if studying a child. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that, dear. But perhaps your aunt neglected to tell you that she failed to renew her stewardship agreement. This land reverted to the community trust years ago, and my family assumed responsibility for its upkeep. The county recognized that." She smiled as though it were all settled. "You're mistaken," Mia snapped. "There's no such thing as a stewardship agreement. I checked with the county this morning." Lauren's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before the mask returned. "Then perhaps you spoke with someone misinformed. Bureaucracies are messy. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself further. Enjoy the event if you like. It might help you understand what real care looks like." Then she turned to the guard and said quietly, "Please escort Miss Rivera off our grounds." Mia's heart pounded as she stood her ground, but 2 guards were already moving toward her. Guests were whispering now, curious, entertained by the commotion. Someone laughed. Maybe she's one of the vendors. Lauren's husband, a tall man with silver hair and the calm cruelty of someone used to power, approached from the tent. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice smooth and detached. Lauren placed a manicured hand on his arm. "Nothing to worry about, darling. Just a misunderstanding. Our neighbor's niece seems confused about property lines." He chuckled softly. "Ah, well, these things happen. Have the survey team send her a copy of the boundary map." They turned away together, already forgetting her. Mia stood frozen, humiliated, as the guards guided her back to her car. The music rose again, soft jazz drifting through the air, as if nothing had happened. She sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel until her hands trembled. Every fiber of her body screamed to drive straight to the sheriff's office, to file a complaint, to make someone listen. But deep down, she already suspected how this would go. People like the Montgomerys didn't need to steal with force. They did it through charm, paperwork, and influence. At the sheriff's office, her fears were confirmed. The deputy listened politely as she explained the situation, glancing occasionally at the clock. When she finished, he sighed. "Miss Rivera, I understand you're upset, but from what you're describing, this sounds like a civil dispute. Property boundaries can get complicated in rural areas. You'll need to take it up with the county assessor." "But they're hosting weddings there," Mia said, incredulous. "They're making money off land that isn't theirs. That's theft." The deputy's eyes softened with a hint of pity. "Even if that's true, it's not a criminal matter unless you can prove intent to defraud. You'll need legal representation." He handed her a pamphlet titled, "Understanding Property Law." She stared at it as if it were an insult. That night back at the motel, she scrolled through social media, half in despair, half in rage. There it was, photos tagged, "Montgomery Gardens Wedding." Dozens of smiling couples under the same oak tree her aunt had once hung wind chimes from. The captions were glowing. "Exclusive venue in Maple Creek. Stunning private estate. Worth every penny." Her chest ached. She clicked on one post and froze. The caption read, "Booked for $15,000, worth every cent for the perfect view. $15,000 per event." The Montgomerys weren't just using her land. They were profiting from it shamelessly. She barely slept. By dawn, she was back at the property, camera in hand. Workers were cleaning up from the night before, tossing confetti into trash bags, rolling up the white carpets. She took photos of everything: the tents, the catering vans, even the damaged patch of wildflowers near the fence where she used to play as a child. One of the workers noticed her and muttered, "You're not supposed to be here." She ignored him. Lauren appeared again, this time in jeans and a sun hat, the casual mask of someone pretending to be approachable. "Still at it?" she said with a tight smile. "You'll exhaust yourself. The land's better off with us. We're giving it purpose." Mia looked her straight in the eye. "You're stealing." Lauren's smile didn't falter. "Stealing? Don't be dramatic. We improved it. You should be grateful. Without us, this place would still be rotting under weeds." Mia's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You're going to regret this." Lauren laughed softly, like someone humoring a child. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, stepping closer, her perfume sharp and expensive. "Do yourself a favor and let it go. You're too young to play landowner in a world you don't understand." Then she turned her back, walking toward her car without another glance. Mia stood there, the morning sun burning against her face, the weight of humiliation replaced by something colder, sharper, more dangerous. For the first time since inheriting her aunt's land, she understood what her tia had meant in that letter, how the soil carried not just roots, but battles. And as the sound of another wedding rehearsal began to echo across the fields, Mia swore she would not let the Montgomerys turn her inheritance into their empire without a fight. Mia spent the next week drowning in paperwork, phone calls, and unanswered emails. Every official office she contacted seemed to hand her off to someone else. First the county recorder, then zoning, then planning, until she realized they were circling her like polite vultures, waiting for her frustration to make her give up. But she didn't. She drove to the county seat herself, stood in line for 3 hours, and demanded to see the original survey maps. When the clerk finally brought them out, the lines were faint, old ink on yellowed paper, but unmistakable. The land, parcel 17B, belonged entirely to Isabella Rivera. Yet when Mia asked for the most recent copy, the clerk hesitated. "It seems there's been an update filed just last month," she said, scrolling on her computer screen. "Boundary adjustment. Filed by..." She stopped, glanced at the screen again, then looked at Mia. "By the Montgomery Trust." The words landed like a blow. Mia's fingers curled against the counter. "On what basis?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The clerk shrugged helplessly. "It references a stewardship clause, apparently from decades ago. But this isn't common. I'd recommend a property lawyer." It was the same polite dismissal she'd heard before, but this time she felt the weight of something deliberate, something engineered. She hired the only lawyer she could afford, a young woman named Celine Harper, who worked out of a cramped office above a diner. Celine was sharp-eyed, quick-spoken, and more skeptical than sympathetic, but she agreed to take the case on contingency after reading the documents. "They're bluffing," she said, tapping the folder with her pen. "There's no such thing as a stewardship clause that transfers ownership. Someone forged or manipulated a local ordinance. This happens more often than people think. Wealthy neighbors take advantage of outdated land records, claim maintenance rights, and absorb the property. If they've hosted events there, they probably insured it under their name, which will help us prove intent." Mia nodded, her pulse quickening. For the first time, she felt she wasn't completely alone. But just as Celine began filing the preliminary injunction, the harassment started. The first incident was small. Her mailbox torn off its post, letters scattered across the dirt road. Then came the phone calls, silent at first, then a low, muffled voice saying her name before hanging up. One morning she found a for sale sign staked in front of her cottage with the logo of Montgomery Realty printed neatly across it. When she stormed to the estate gates demanding an explanation, Lauren wasn't home, but her husband appeared, calm as ever, a coffee cup in his hand. "You're trespassing again, Miss Rivera," he said mildly. "You should be careful about that." "That sign," she said, pointing toward the road, her voice trembling with anger. "You put it there." He smiled faintly. "We have no interest in your property, though I do think you'd be happier if you sold it to someone capable of maintaining it. You see, land is like water. It flows to where it's best cared for." His tone was smooth, rehearsed, and it infuriated her. "You don't own me," she hissed. He raised his brow, that faint smile never fading. "No, but we own everything around you." That night, the lights in her cottage flickered and went out. The electrician she called the next morning found that the power line had been deliberately severed near the road. "Clean cut," he said, shaking his head. "Somebody knew what they were doing." Mia felt the first wave of real fear. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a campaign. The Montgomerys weren't trying to intimidate her into silence. They were erasing her presence piece by piece. When she told Celine, her lawyer leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. "Document everything," she said. "Photos, dates, times. We'll file a harassment complaint if this continues. But be careful. These people have influence." Days later, Mia drove past the property line and saw construction crews on her land, setting up new fencing and decorative lighting. She stopped her car and got out, shouting for them to leave. A foreman glanced at her clipboard and said flatly, "Ma'am, we've got authorization from the Montgomery estate. They said the boundary issue's been settled." "It hasn't," Mia yelled. "You're trespassing." But they ignored her, continuing to drill holes into the soil her aunt had once planted marigolds in. Furious, she pulled out her phone and started recording. The foreman finally looked up, his expression cold. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. Miss Montgomery doesn't like troublemakers." His use of the singular word miss instead of Mrs. made her skin crawl. It wasn't just familiarity, it was power. These people answered to her. That evening, as she uploaded the footage to a cloud drive, her inbox pinged with an email from an anonymous sender. "You're wasting your time. Walk away while you still can." Attached was a blurry photo of her taken that morning, standing by the fence line, her phone raised. Her heart sank. Someone had been watching her from the woods. She closed the curtains, locked every door, and sat in the dark until sunrise, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. Celine filed an emergency motion the next day, requesting an immediate halt to any construction or commercial activity on the disputed land. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. Word must have spread quickly because the Montgomerys escalated again. A letter arrived on expensive paper, embossed with gold. Notice of defamation. It accused Mia of damaging the family's reputation, of harassing their staff, and spreading false information online. The letter demanded an apology and a retraction, or a civil suit would follow. When she showed it to Celine, the lawyer smirked. Classic intimidation tactic. They're trying to scare you into submission. Don't respond. Let me handle it. But fear wasn't the only emotion gnawing at Mia now. Beneath it, anger pulsed like electricity. One evening she drove up to the hill overlooking the estate. The venue was alive again. Music, laughter, lanterns swinging from the trees. Through her camera lens, she zoomed in on the crowd and recognized Lauren in a silver gown, toasting with guests under strings of lights. Behind her, a sign glowed faintly in the dark. The Montgomery Gardens, private events only. It was the first time she truly understood the scale of what they had done. It wasn't just theft. It was reinvention. They had taken her aunt's land and turned it into a brand, a product, something beautiful and hollow. Watching them celebrate over it filled her with a sense of betrayal so deep it blurred the edges of her vision. That night, she found her car tires slashed. The police officer who came barely looked interested. "Probably kids," he said, scribbling half-heartedly in his notebook. "Lot of pranks in these parts." She wanted to scream. "Someone sent me threats. Someone's on my property." The officer sighed. "Miss Rivera, unless there's evidence linking these incidents to a specific person, my hands are tied." As he left, she caught sight of a Montgomery security decal on the side of his clipboard. Her chest went cold. When she called Celine again, her lawyer's tone was low, measured. "Mia, I've seen this before. They'll push until you either break or settle. But if you keep standing, they'll make a mistake. Rich people always do. They think their power makes them untouchable." Mia sat at the window, watching the distant glow of the venue lights flickering against the night sky. Somewhere in that glow, her aunt's spirit felt restless, waiting for justice. Mia whispered quietly, "They think I'll give up. They don't know me." And as the wind carried faint strains of wedding music through the darkness, she realized she wasn't fighting for land anymore. She was fighting for truth, for her name, and for every quiet person who had ever been trampled by those who believed ownership was a birthright of the rich. By the time the hearing date arrived, Mia's nerves were raw. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and constant anxiety had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, but she was determined not to show weakness. She sat beside Celine in the narrow courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish, her palms slick against the cool surface of the table. Across from them, Lauren and her husband lounged with practiced composure, flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. Everything about them radiated control, their quiet laughter, the synchronized turning of heads, the faint perfume that clung to the air whenever Lauren leaned forward to whisper something to her counsel. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Mia felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs as the proceedings began. Celine was calm, her voice steady as she presented the evidence. The deed signed by Isabella Rivera, the county records confirming no sale or lien, the photographs showing the Montgomerys' commercial use of the land. Then came the part that made Mia's stomach twist. The defense. Lauren's lawyer, a tall man with a voice like sandpaper, argued that the land had been functionally abandoned for over a decade and that the Montgomery family had invested substantial resources into maintaining and improving it. He presented invoices for landscaping, photographs of the property's transformation, and a supposed community stewardship agreement dated 25 years earlier, which declared the Montgomery Trust responsible for upkeep in exchange for usage rights. The document was grainy, faintly smudged, but stamped with what appeared to be an official seal. Mia leaned toward Celine and whispered, "That's fake." Her lawyer's eyes flicked briefly toward her, but she didn't respond. She simply took a note on her pad. When it was time for testimony, Lauren spoke with the calm poise of a woman accustomed to being believed. She described how her family had rescued the land from decay, how weddings had brought joy to the community, how the property had been forgotten after Isabella fell ill. Her tone was soft, mournful even, as if she were the victim of misplaced gratitude. The audience murmured sympathetically. Mia felt her fists tighten under the table. Every word twisted reality into something elegant and false, and yet it was working. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but Mia sensed the weight of wealth in the room, an invisible gravity that bent truth until it aligned with money. Then Celine rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Montgomery," she began, her voice smooth and deliberate, "you claim the land was abandoned. Are you aware that Ms. Rivera here inherited the property through a valid will less than 6 months ago?" Lauren smiled faintly. "Of course, but inheritance doesn't change the history of neglect." "Neglect," Celine repeated. "And yet you hosted 12 weddings there last year. Do you consider profit-making to be a form of community stewardship?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the spectators. Lauren's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. "We reinvested that money into maintenance," Lauren replied smoothly. "Without us, that property would be a wasteland." Celine nodded slowly. "And yet your insurance policies list the parcel as part of your estate. That's not maintenance. That's ownership." For the first time, Lauren's expression flickered. The hearing ended without resolution, the judge scheduling a continuation pending verification of documents. As they left the courthouse, Celine muttered, "They'll stall us." But that document, they overplayed their hand. It's too new, the ink's too fresh. If we can find the original county seal they forged, we can destroy their claim. She was right. The fake agreement referenced a defunct zoning department that had merged 15 years ago. Someone had gone to great lengths to fabricate legitimacy. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She sat by her window watching fog roll across the field, thinking about her aunt. Isabella had been meticulous, the kind of woman who kept every receipt and letter in neatly labeled boxes. Maybe, Mia thought, the proof they needed wasn't in some courthouse. It was still in the house itself. The next morning she drove to the cottage and began to search. She opened every drawer, every trunk, sorting through dusty ledgers, yellowed envelopes, and brittle photographs. In one old filing box tucked beneath the bed, she found a folder marked Rivera Estate. Inside were letters between Isabella and the county from 20 years earlier, correspondence about opting out of an early land association agreement proposed by the Montgomery family. One line made Mia's breath catch. "Per our conversation, I decline inclusion in the Montgomery Stewardship Trust, as the land has been independently maintained by the Rivera family for over 50 years. It was signed and notarized. This was the smoking gun, the rejection of any supposed agreement." She stared at it, trembling, the relief so sharp it almost felt painful. Celine nearly shouted when Mia brought her the document. "This is perfect," she said. "They can't claim stewardship if your aunt formally declined participation. We'll submit it to the court immediately." But as she scanned the paper, her brow furrowed. "The date stamp is missing. The corner was torn off." Mia nodded. "It must have happened when the files got wet. There was a leak last year." "It's still admissible," Celine said, but her voice carried a note of worry. "They'll attack its authenticity. We'll need a witness who can verify it." That afternoon, Mia went door to door in the old neighborhood, seeking anyone who remembered her aunt. Most of the neighbors were gone, their homes sold or absorbed by the Montgomerys. But finally she found one, an elderly man named Harold Price, who lived alone on the edge of the ridge. He squinted at the paper through thick glasses. "I remember this," he said slowly. "Your aunt made a fuss about that trust nonsense. She was proud of standing her ground. I even signed as a witness, though I never kept my copy." He looked up, his pale eyes steady. "You tell that Montgomery woman I said some of us remember the truth." With Harold's statement and the letter in hand, Celine filed an amendment to their case. For a moment, victory felt close enough to touch. But just as they started to breathe again, a new setback arrived. The following morning, Mia's phone buzzed with a news alert. Montgomery Gardens faces legal challenge from local woman claiming ownership. The article was filled with quotes from anonymous community sources, painting Mia as unstable, an opportunist trying to extort money from a respected family. There were even photographs, ones taken without her consent, showing her in court, in her driveway, looking disheveled and angry. The comments were cruel. "She's probably after a payout. Some people can't stand success." Mia's stomach twisted. She knew Lauren was behind it. Celine was furious. They're using the press to poison public perception, but that means they're nervous. They know you're getting close. Mia wanted to believe that, but the harassment intensified. Someone broke into her cottage, not to steal, but to desecrate. Furniture overturned, family photographs shredded, and a single wedding invitation placed on the kitchen table, embossed with gold. "The Montgomery Gardens welcomes you." Her hands shook as she held it, her fear mixing with rage. She called the police again, but they treated it like vandalism. One officer muttered, "You sure you didn't just make someone angry online?" That night, she stayed with Celine, too afraid to return alone. As they sat in the dim light of the office, surrounded by files, Celine said quietly, "You're in deeper than I thought. They're trying to break you psychologically. But this is also their mistake. They're leaving a trail. Fear makes people sloppy." She looked at Mia, her expression softening for the first time. "You remind me of someone I once represented, another woman who refused to sell her land. She lost everything before she won. But she did win. Don't let them rewrite your story." The next morning, Mia received a small package without a return address. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no explanation. When she plugged it into her laptop, a series of video files appeared, footage from what looked like a security camera. The images were grainy, but clear enough. Lauren and two men in suits walking along the edge of Mia's land at night, pointing to the fence and discussing adjusting the boundary lines. The audio was faint, but the words were unmistakable. "If she takes it to court, we'll handle it. I know the assessor. He'll sign whatever we need." Mia stared at the screen, her pulse racing. Someone from inside their circle had sent this. A whistleblower, maybe, or a worker with a conscience. When she showed it to Celine, her lawyer's expression hardened. "This changes everything. If we authenticate this, it's over for them." But even as hope flickered again, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Celine opened it to find a courier holding another letter, this one a summons. The Montgomery Trust had filed a countersuit for defamation and trespassing, demanding $500,000 in damages. The timing was deliberate. Mia understood the message clearly. They wanted to drown her in fear and debt until she surrendered. She looked out the window, toward the faint silhouette of her aunt's land under the fading sun, and for the first time she didn't feel like the frightened girl who had stumbled into a stranger's wedding. She felt the quiet fury of someone who had been robbed, lied to, and erased, and who was finally ready to burn the illusion of their perfection to the ground. The following weeks unfolded like a slow war waged on every front. Each day brought a new kind of assault, some legal, some psychological, and others that felt personal in ways that words could not capture. Mia's lawyer fought the countersuit aggressively, filing for dismissal and submitting the flash drive evidence to an independent forensic specialist. But the Montgomerys' influence stretched further than either of them had anticipated. The lab that had agreed to authenticate the video abruptly withdrew, citing conflict of interest, and when Celine pressed for details, she was told that the company's board included one of the Montgomery trustees. Every road they took seemed to curve back toward the same gilded wall. Mia tried to hold her composure, but there were nights when she would wake at 2 a.m, the sound of phantom music drifting through her dreams. Strings, laughter, and applause carried on a wind that wasn't there. Even when she visited the property in daylight, she could feel that same echo lingering in the air, like the ghost of her aunt's legacy smothered beneath rented joy. The Montgomerys doubled their efforts to erase her presence. They began building a permanent event hall on the land, a structure of white columns and glass, its foundation already laid over the wildflower meadow her aunt had once cherished. A glossy sign by the road read, "Montgomery Gardens Pavilion, opening soon." When Mia confronted the construction crew again, they refused to speak to her, pointing to an order stamped with the county seal. But the seal was the same forged emblem she had already seen on the fake agreement, and she knew it. Furious, she stormed into the county zoning office demanding answers. The clerk she had spoken with weeks ago avoided her eyes, insisting the permits were in order. When Mia asked to see the file, she was told the records were temporarily unavailable due to digital updates. The tone was careful, rehearsed, as though the woman had been instructed on what to say. Mia walked out shaking, her voice lost somewhere between rage and helplessness. That evening she received another message, this time a voicemail. The voice was male, deep, and calm. "You're fighting a battle you can't win, Miss Rivera. Walk away. They'll pay you for the deed, more than it's worth. But if you keep pushing, things will get ugly." The call ended with a click that seemed to echo forever in the small living room. She replayed it twice before sending it to Celine. Her lawyer listened in silence, then said quietly, "They're escalating. That means they're afraid. Don't answer any unknown numbers, and don't go anywhere alone." But isolation was becoming unavoidable. People around town had begun treating her like a problem. The grocery clerk who used to smile now avoided her eyes. The gas station attendant refused to let her use the restroom, muttering something about troublemakers from up the hill. When she tried to meet Harold Price again, the elderly neighbor who had given a statement in her favor, his front porch light was off, and no one answered the door. The next morning, Celine called to say he had been hospitalized after an accidental fall. Mia didn't believe it. There were no coincidences anymore. Determined to preserve what evidence remained, Mia began recording everything. Phone calls, conversations, even the noise outside her cottage at night. It wasn't paranoia if it kept her alive. The recordings captured strange things: cars idling on the road for hours, footsteps outside her porch, and once, faint voices discussing the cleanup before the next event. When she tried to share the audio online, the post was removed within an hour for violating community guidelines. Celine warned her not to post again. "They'll claim defamation, and it'll hurt our case," she said. "I need you to trust the process." But trust was growing thin, and fear had begun to rot it from the inside. A week later, the situation erupted publicly. A journalist from the local paper published an exposé titled, "Wedding Empire or Land Heist? The Montgomery Gardens Scandal." The article featured snippets from the leaked video and interviews with anonymous sources who described bribes within the county office. It was everything Mia had hoped for, and everything Lauren had feared. Within hours, the Montgomerys released a statement denying all allegations and accusing Mia of fabricating evidence to sabotage a community institution. They announced a charity event to restore faith in the gardens, complete with celebrity guests and a live orchestra. The story divided the town. Some believed Mia, others saw her as a jealous inheritor trying to destroy success she couldn't replicate. The press called her for interviews. She refused most of them, but one evening, driven by desperation, she appeared on a local news broadcast. Sitting beneath harsh studio lights, she spoke directly into the camera, her voice trembling but clear. "This land belonged to my family for generations," she said. "It's been taken from me through forged documents and intimidation. I won't stop until the truth is known." The clip went viral overnight. Support poured in from strangers online, but the Montgomerys answered swiftly. They filed a restraining order claiming she was harassing their employees and interfering with business operations. The order restricted her from coming within 100 feet of the venue, effectively exiling her from her own land. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so real. When Celine protested, the judge, a man whose campaign had been funded in part by the Montgomery Family Foundation, granted the temporary injunction anyway. "For the sake of public order," he said blandly. Mia felt her breath catch as the gavel struck. That night, she drove past the property anyway, staying on the public road. The new pavilion glowed against the dark horizon, its glass walls shimmering under strings of light. She stopped the car and turned off the engine. Through binoculars, she could see Lauren standing with guests, laughing, a glass of champagne in hand. The sound of faint music reached her through the open window. Soft piano, distant applause. Something inside her cracked then. She had tried civility, patience, law, truth. None of it mattered. They were rewriting reality faster than she could prove it existed. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white, then whispered to herself, "If they want war, I'll give it to them." The next day, she began her counterattack. She sent the leaked footage and all her documentation to 3 national investigative outlets, along with a detailed statement of the county's corruption. 2 ignored her, but 1 responded. A journalist named Reed Garner from an independent digital network. His reply was cautious, but interested. "If you can prove forgery, we'll run the story. But you have to be ready for blowback." She was ready. Together, they traced the forged seal to a printing firm registered under a shell company connected to a Montgomery business partner. Reed managed to record a phone call with one of the employees, who admitted that they had reproduced a historical county seal for a private client. It was the missing piece. Before they could publish, however, Reed's car was vandalized, his tires slashed, and his files stolen. He called Mia that night, whispering through static, "They know. I'm going underground for a few days. Stay safe." Then the line went dead. Mia's fear hardened into something colder, a steady, consuming determination. She drove to the courthouse the next morning and filed an emergency appeal, attaching the partial transcripts and evidence she still had. Celine warned her that it might not hold up, but it was enough to trigger a review. The judge reluctantly scheduled a new hearing. As she left the courthouse, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, but she could feel eyes on her. When she started her car, the SUV pulled out behind her, following at a distance through the winding roads. She tried to shake it, turning off onto side streets, but it stayed there for miles until finally disappearing into the dusk. By the time she reached her cottage, the fear had calcified into a strange calm. She locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, watching the horizon. Far away, the Montgomery Gardens still glowed like a mirage, beautiful and poisonous. The wind carried faint traces of music again, and she thought of her aunt's words, the ones she had underlined in her letter. Our roots are our defense. No one can steal what you're willing to fight for. It was then that Mia made her final decision. She wasn't going to wait for justice anymore. She would expose them by force if she had to, drag their lies into the light, burn their illusions to ash. The Montgomerys had taken her land, her peace, and her safety. All that was left to take was her fear, and she was done giving them that. The morning of the final hearing arrived beneath a low sky the color of lead, the kind of weather that felt like warning. Mia woke before dawn, unable to eat, unable to breathe without feeling the weight of the months pressing against her chest. Everything had narrowed to this one day. Celine picked her up in silence, the air inside the car thick with anticipation and exhaustion. They drove through the mist, the courthouse rising out of the fog like an old fortress, its stone facade glistening with the first drops of rain. Reporters were already gathered near the steps, their cameras waiting, flashes cutting through the gray. The story had reached national attention after Reed's article was finally published, exposing the forged documents, the shell companies, and the network of local officials complicit in the Montgomery's expansion. The county had been forced to open an internal investigation, but the hearing today would decide whether the land itself, and Mia's family legacy, would be restored or lost forever. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different. The Montgomerys still looked immaculate, their lawyers confident, but there was a tension underneath their composure, a thin crack in the performance. Lauren avoided Mia's eyes for the first time. Celine organized her files with mechanical precision, her lips pressed into a thin line. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and the rustle of movement filled the room like a wave. The proceedings began with procedural formality, the recitation of motions, the acknowledgement of evidence. But beneath it all was a pulse of electricity. Celine spoke first, her voice measured, each word carefully honed. She laid out the chain of fraud, the fake stewardship agreement, the forged seal, the manipulation of property maps, the false claims of abandonment, and finally, the calculated harassment that had followed every time Mia sought justice. Then she presented the new evidence, the full recording authenticated by digital forensics, where Lauren's husband could be heard discussing the boundary adjustment and bribing the assessor. When the audio filled the room, the air changed. Even the judge, who had maintained a stoic detachment through the earlier hearings, leaned forward slightly. The Montgomerys' attorney objected, claiming the recording was illegally obtained, but Celine countered smoothly that it had been submitted through a whistleblower and verified through lawful channels. The objection was overruled. Lauren's composure began to unravel. Her hands trembled slightly as her lawyer whispered in her ear, but she shook him off and stood up, asking to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling with the effort of control. "This entire proceeding is built on resentment. We improved that land when no one else cared. We turned it into something beautiful, something that benefited everyone. I refuse to apologize for that." Her words rang hollow against the walls. Celine rose calmly. "Improvement doesn't justify theft," she said. "You profited from another person's inheritance and destroyed her right to her own history. That isn't stewardship. It's exploitation." The judge called for order as the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. He took a long pause before speaking, his tone deliberate and grave. "The evidence submitted shows a clear pattern of fraudulent behavior and abuse of local authority. The court recognizes Mia Rivera as the lawful owner of the property known as Parcel 17B. Furthermore, this court recommends referral of the Montgomery Trust and associated parties to the district attorney for criminal investigation." The sound of the gavel striking the bench was sharp and final. For a moment, Mia couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt, her breath catching in her throat. Then the realization hit. She had won. Not a symbolic victory, not just moral validation, but real, tangible justice. The Montgomerys' empire, polished and untouchable for decades, was crumbling under the weight of its own deceit. Lauren's husband rose abruptly, shouting about appeals and slander, but his voice was drowned by the sudden noise of reporters rushing from the courtroom to deliver the news. Lauren remained seated, staring straight ahead, her expression a mask of disbelief that cracked only when she whispered something under her breath. Mia couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the tone. Hatred, pure and quiet. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour. Cameras flashed as Mia and Celine stepped into the storm, but for the first time in months, the attention didn't feel suffocating. It felt cleansing. The reporters shouted questions, asking if she planned to sue for damages, if she would reopen the property, but she didn't answer. She only looked up at the sky and let the rain wash the exhaustion from her face. When Celine touched her shoulder and whispered, "It's over," Mia shook her head gently. "No," she said softly. "It's just beginning." That night she drove back to the land alone. The tents were gone, the chairs removed, and the lights that had once shimmered through the trees were dark. The pavilion construction had been halted mid-frame, metal ribs of the structure standing stark and skeletal against the sky. She walked through the field, mud clinging to her boots, her heart heavy but calm. She reached the old oak where her aunt used to hang the wind chimes, and found one still dangling there, half rusted but intact. The wind stirred, and it made a faint, uneven melody that sounded like a heartbeat. She knelt and pressed her hand to the damp soil, whispering, "It's ours again." For the first time, the ground felt alive beneath her, not as a possession, but as a promise. Behind her, the faint glow of approaching headlights flickered once, then vanished down the road. She didn't turn to look. The fight was finished, and whatever came next, she knew she could face it. The Montgomery name would be dragged through courts and headlines for months, their wealth bleeding into fines and settlements, their influence stripped away. But Mia's victory wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Her aunt's legacy was no longer just memory. It was land reclaimed, justice made real, and the quiet proof that even against money, corruption, and fear, one voice, if it refuses to break, can still echo loud enough to change everything. Weeks passed before the noise finally began to fade. The headlines shifted to new scandals, the reporters stopped calling, and the town that had once whispered about Mia now regarded her with a quiet, wary respect. The Montgomery estate stood empty, its tall gates chained and sealed by court order, the gardens overgrown and silent. A few of their former employees came forward with testimonies, confirming what everyone had begun to suspect, that the family had used intimidation, bribes, and falsified permits for years. Lauren and her husband disappeared from public view, their lawyers left to salvage what was left of their empire, but no one in Maple Creek seemed to mourn their absence. It was as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Mia spent most of her days on the property now, rebuilding what had been broken. She cleared the debris, tore down the half-finished pavilion, and restored the wildflower meadow that had once covered the hillside. She worked slowly, deliberately, her hands blistered, and her clothes always streaked with dirt, but she didn't mind. Every nail she pulled, every weed she dug up felt like an act of reclamation, not just of the land, but of herself. The cottage that had once seemed haunted now felt alive again. The air carried the scent of soil and rain, and sometimes when the sun set behind the trees, she could almost see her aunt standing on the porch, smiling the way she used to, her voice soft and certain. "You did what I couldn't." The letters began arriving one by one, strangers from across the country who had read her story and wanted to thank her for standing up when the system tried to silence her. Some sent photographs of their own family land disputes. Others offered donations to help her maintain the property. She refused the money, but answered every letter. She had learned that the real fight wasn't only in the courtroom. It was in the quiet persistence to protect what was rightfully yours, even when no one else believed you. By early summer, the meadow bloomed again. Wild poppies, sunflowers, and bluebells covered the field in a riot of color. erasing the scars left by construction. She placed a small wooden sign at the entrance, carved with the words, Rivera Sanctuary, not to keep people out, but to remind them what it meant to belong without taking. Sometimes travelers stopped by, drawn by the story or the beauty of the place, and Mia would greet them kindly, offering lemonade and a smile that still carried a trace of exhaustion, but also something new: peace. One evening, as twilight melted into the trees, she sat on the porch with Celine, who had become more friend than lawyer. They watched the fireflies rise over the grass, the air humming with their quiet rhythm. "You could sell this land for a fortune now," Celine said, half teasing. Mia shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not for sale. Not anymore. Some things aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be kept alive." Her voice was calm, unshaken, the kind of voice born from surviving storms. When night fell, she walked into the field, the wind tugging gently at her hair, and stood where the altar had once stood during those stolen weddings. The stars shimmered faintly above, and she closed her eyes, letting the silence settle around her. The fight, the fear, the loneliness, all of it had become part of the soil now, feeding something stronger. The land no longer carried the weight of loss. It carried the proof of endurance. And as she breathed in the cool air, she knew with absolute certainty that this was what victory was supposed to feel like. Not triumph over others, but peace after surviving them.